Hey guys, this is John. This is analysis from Game 4 of the 2018 World Chess Championship in London, England. The players were knotted at a point and a half each going into this game. If you want to think of this match in terms of points, this 12-game match, it's a race to 6.5 points. Even though we've had all draws so far, 3 draws, the players have been accumulating these points, and if there's one decisive game and the rest draws, that's enough to put you over the edge at the end. So Magnus was back again with the white pieces, and he opened with c4 this time. He played d4 in game 2, didn't get anything after Fabiano played that rook d8 surprise in the QGD. So Magnus goes in a completely different direction. Fabiano answers with e5. In my opinion, this is one of the strongest responses to the English, along with c5, the symmetrical English. But there are a lot of responses to the English. White is controlling the center, controlling the d5 square, but the fact that black can reasonably push any of these pawns means that black has quite a bit of flexibility, or even play knight f6, or even go for a fianchetto g6. But c5, e5 would be my bet for the strongest replies here. So Caruana 6 to e5, which he has played a lot from the black side, and as we'll see, has also played it from the white side. Magnus plays knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, developing and attacking this pawn. And Fabiano just chooses to defend it, knight c6 developing. All 4 of the knights are out. You might wonder, well, why not push e4 and attack this knight with tempo? Problem is, this pawn runs the risk of being overextended. White can play knight g5 and attack it again, and if black wants to defend it with queen e7, then they might have some coordination issues with the bishop on f8. So knight c6, much more solid. And Magnus plays g3, so now we're entering reverse Sicilian waters, if you want to think of it as a reverse dragon, where white is going for the fianchetto. And Fabiano played directly, so he plays d5, going into like a reversed open Sicilian. Interestingly, I think Niklas Huschenbett, whose channel you should definitely check out, there's a lot of good content, he says that black could have played bishop b4 and we would have had like a reversed Roslimo of sorts. Shades of games 1 and 2. Or sorry, games 1 and 3, actually, with Fabiano having the white pieces. But yeah, no Roslimo type business today. Fabiano just plays d5, breaks in the center. C takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop g2. And now Fabiano plays a move that seems to be a specialty of some top-level players. But previously, before the top level started using this move, I don't think it was considered even playable, or people even thought to play this move. So it's bishop c5 for black. Developing the bishop actively, but this does beg the question, what happens if white takes on e5? Because by putting the bishop on g2, white is generating pressure against that knight, even though there is this knight on f3 in the way. So bishop c5 challenges white to play knight takes e5, and we're definitely going to check that move. But I wanted to point out that Fabiano has played bishop c5 on a few occasions. And as I said, he's played this line from the white side as well before. So I don't think bishop c5 was a surprise to Magnus, but the developments coming up here are interesting. So Magnus decides to castle. Now, knight takes e5, that's got to be the critical move against bishop c5, that is. So if this is played, the idea for white is simple. If black were to take back, we can just take on d5, and we've won a very valuable pawn, a very valuable center pawn. So the issue, though, is on knight takes e5, black can play this desperado move, knight takes c3. Or in-between move, probably more accurately. And by playing knight takes c3, we're attacking the queen here. There are 3 possible captures in this position. Actually, 4 possible captures. Knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and then either pawn capturing. Let's check all of them real quick, because this is how you would make a proof of a decision in chess, like a very concrete tactical decision. You got to work through your candidate moves, especially if those are forcing moves. And this won't take us very long. So first of all, let's say that knight takes c6 is played. Okay, so this is one of the more volatile looking moves. White is responding to an attack on their queen by taking something of black's, but still trying to emerge up a pawn. If black were to take back, then white could finally take here. But this is met with the very nice move queen f6. So black has the jump on white by 1 move and can thereby save their queen, threaten a checkmate on f2, the old scholar's mate type idea, and the white queen is hanging. So this would be an absolute disaster for white. White would have to play this, but this is not going to be good. White's king on the run, just losing. So knight takes c6 is not going to be working. What about bishop takes c6? This move is possible, But after b takes c6, white's going to have to take the knight. So let's say b takes c3. If d takes c3, I think black can trade and then take on f2. I looked at this position with the engine a little bit just to see if after e3 this bishop has any possibility of being trapped. But looks like black can play f6. In all the lines I looked at, black was able to save the bishop or generate enough counterplay. For instance, if knight d3, trying to attack this bishop, there's bishop g4 check, king c2, and now this really annoying move, bishop f5, pinning the knight. Black has rook d8 or castles on the way to increase the pressure. This bishop's not getting out anytime soon, so the fact that the bishop on f2 is entombed is not a big deal here. So, yeah, in this position, b takes c3 could be played, but now queen d5, attacking the knight on e5, which is undefended, and also the rook on h1, 2 undefended pieces. Always got to keep track of your undefended pieces. White can save the material by playing knight f3, but now bishop h3, straining white's king in the center. Black is down a pawn here, but just visually, black looks like they have a ton of compensation. Black's king is going to be real safe on the king side. I don't think you'll find many takers for this position, playing it as white, even though white is up a pawn. So that's what happens in this line after bishop takes c6. So we looked at knight takes c6. We looked at bishop takes c6. What about the possible captures here? Well, if d takes c3, that doesn't work so well because black can just trade queens and then take on e5. And white's idea has been a failure because black got in that knight takes c3 in between move and then successfully took on e5. White is just down a piece for a pawn here. So that is insufficient. So relatively best in all this, if we go down this volatile path with knight takes e5 to begin with, is knight takes c3 and b takes c3. But after knight takes e5 and now d4, this is the main idea for white, trying to win back the piece. I think black can just respond to this with bishop d6. Looks very solid. D takes e5, bishop takes e5, and I don't see what black has to fear here. It's equal material. You can say that white's structure is even more suspect because white has 2 isolated pawns and black is threatening bishop takes c3. There could be a trade of queens, but I don't think there's enough material on board for white to do any sort of damage here. Black's ready to play c6, blunt this bishop on g2, which is a big theme in this game. Put the king on c7. Beautiful bishop here for the moment, compelling white to defend this pawn. So that's how I would think about this position here if I were white seeing it for the first time. Black's played bishop c5, thereby challenging us to play knight takes e5. And then what are the candidate moves after knight takes c3? And regardless of what color you're playing here, you would have to check all those candidate moves. And that would be a lot to do over the board the first time around. I'm sure Magnus has looked at this line in his prep and probably determined that knight takes e5 brings no advantage to white. So what does Magnus do? He decides to castle instead. Well, I should also mention that in this position, instead of bishop c5, it's much more common for black to play knight b6, just withdrawing the knight from the center and thereby avoiding any problems with knight takes e5. Black can also play bishop e6, nice square for the bishop, reinforcing. But this bishop c5 move, it's a computer-approved move that apparently challenges white to play knight takes e5, and knight takes e5 doesn't lead to anything as far as I can tell. So if it works, it's a nice active move, and no wonder that the top guys are playing this. So Magnus castles, Fabiano castles. And now here again, we could try to check the same type of line if knight takes e5 is played. But knight takes c3 is again the answer. And these complications just don't seem to work out so well. If b takes c3 again, knight takes e5, d4, bishop comes back to d6. If after knight takes c3, knight takes c6 is played, I think some problems arise in this line where black can play bishop takes f2 check. And if king h1, bishop g4, looks like a mess, but black is coming out on top here. There's an attack on e2, and this knight is under attack on d8. So knight takes e5 not working so well. Once again, there was a game that Levon Aronian played on the white side against Fabiano Caruana at the 2017 St. Louis Rapid and Blitz event, where Aronian decided to play knight takes d5. Aronian's a very good English player to watch, by the way. He handles this opening phenomenally. So that game went knight takes d5, queen takes d5, knight g5. Discovery on the queen here, queen d8, and now Aronian played this cool-looking shot, knight takes h7, seemingly coming out of nowhere. with the point being that if king takes h7, queen c2 check forks the king and the bishop, and white goes up a pawn. So Fabiano responded to this with rook e8, and I believe Aronian eventually won this game. But you can bet that Fabiano had something prepared in this line, because if he's allowing white the option of playing knight takes d5 again, he's for sure looked at it. Just in my very brief analysis of this, knight g5, I saw that queen c4 was one of the recommendations of the computer, or maybe he would have gone for queen d8 again and had something in mind if knight takes h7. But at any rate, Magnus did not challenge him in that. He plays d3, and this has also been played before. And now Fabiano plays rook e8, which, as I understand it, is a little bit rare, this rook e8 move, but it looks quite helpful. So putting the rook behind the pawn, in a lot of lines, e4 can be very helpful for black. Also frees up the f8 square. I think in this line, the bishop is more likely to drop back to b6, but there are analogous positions where the bishop is on e7 and black will still play rook e8 and sometimes put the bishop back here. But it looks like a helpful move. Again, the tactics don't seem to work in the center for white, so Magnus played bishop d2 here. And now Caruana has had this position on the white side, again from a game in 2017. So Fabiano versus Michael Adams at the London Chess Classic. So same city they're playing the World Championship in just 1 year ago. And in that game, Caruana with white played knight g5, which attacks the knight on d5 twice, here and here. And this was analyzed a little bit by Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky in his chess.com recap from today. So he looked at this possibility, which is how the game went. Queen b3 hitting the pawn on f7, queen e7, knight d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, ganging up on f7. And now Michael Adams played knight d8 in that 2017 game, but Alex was speculating that maybe Fabiano had prepared this move knight d4. This was a possible improvement, which invites some interesting complications because white can make good on this f7 threat. Bishop takes f7, but after king h8, you can see that white has a number of far-flung pieces and the queen is under attack. And Alex looks at queen d1 and he shows how if queen d1, bishop g4 is very unpleasant for white. I 100% agree. I wouldn't want anything to do with this position for white with the pressure here. And if queen c4, black can play rook f8. Black is best off not even taking this pawn yet. And bishop h5, g6. There's some crazy engine lines where it seems like black is definitely holding his own and perhaps even better. So this is pure speculation, but this might be the improvement that Fabiano has over his own game where he played knight g5 with success against Michael Adams. Magnus played bishop to d2. This is a very normal move. If you play the Dragon Sicilian as black, you'll be well aware. So putting the bishop here, which is helpful. It prepares for the rook to come over to c1. Also, if there's a capture on c3, then white has the option of taking with the bishop, as we will see. And Fabiano does decide to take here. And now normally in Sicilian structures, and again, this is a reversed Sicilian, so you can think of it this way. Normally it's good to take with the pawn towards the center. But I think the fact that black can readily play e4 at a moment's notice is a little annoying for white here. Black may not want to do it right away, so bishop b6 looks like a helpful move. Just drop the bishop back and ensure that it's not under attack in many lines. I saw the computer was really keen to play h6 as well, which controls the g5 square, make sure white can't jump if ever e4 takes, rook takes is played. And I think the threat of e4 is sort of annoying for white. Note that white can't stop it because the d3 pawn will hang. So I don't believe that b takes c3 is even leading to much for white here, even though normally in the Sicilian it's good to capture towards the center. So Magnus takes with the bishop. And now knight d4. So Fabiano jumps the knight in, makes use of the fact that there is no pawn there guarding the square. Sorry about that. My board is going a little haywire. Well, okay. You gonna chill out? All right. We're good now. Okay, bishop takes c3. And yeah, Fabiano jumps into the d4 square. And now, this phase of the game actually reminded me of a game that Magnus played on the white side in the 2013 World Championship match, where he was facing Vishy Anand and took the title from him, their match in Chennai, India. Because there was a game where Magnus took on the following structure. So let's say Magnus plays knight takes d4 here, pawn takes d4, bishop back to d2. So Magnus had the same pawn structure against Anand in that game. And traditionally, this has been thought to be just fine for black because black always has good pressure against the pawn on e2. And if you watch that match, follow that match, you'll remember this memorable queen h1 move that Magnus played at one moment. He put his queen on h1 with the bishop on g2 and created this long distance battery. But try as he might, he could not take down Anand in that game, and I think Anand held a pretty comfortable draw. So this moment reminded me of that, because that structure was possible if Magnus were to take, but it's probably not wise to do it. So he decides to play b4 here. Another game that Caruana has experience with. So he had this position against Wesley So. Caruana was black in the Paris leg of the Grand Chess Tour this year. And Wesley preferred rook c1 in this position, which is, as I mentioned, one of the perks of playing bishop d2. You can get this square available for the rook. But Wesley just played bishop b6. Or sorry, Fabiano played bishop b6. Wesley played rook e1. Fabiano played bishop g4, developing, putting pressure on the knight. Bishop takes d4, e takes d4. Again, they got this structure. a3, c6, and I think if anyone's better here, it's probably black. I would take black with the two bishops and the possible pressure against e2. So that also seems like no improvement, playing rook c1 here. So Magnus plays b4, hitting the bishop. And now Fabiano makes an interesting decision. He plays bishop d6. I don't think there's anything wrong with bishop b6 per se if he wants to keep more defenders on b4, but he returns the bishop to d6. And Magnus plays rook b1, reinforcing the b4 pawn. Now, on bishop d6, you are losing two defenders of d4 because the bishop is no longer defending and the queen is blocked. So we must look at what happens if white were to take. So let's say white takes with the knight and then bishop takes. But this is an undefended bishop, so you should immediately look at ways that you can take advantage of that, and those ways are bishop takes g3 or bishop takes b4. I saw both moves analyzed on some of the broadcasts. I think bishop takes g3 is probably a little better. So after h takes g3, queen takes d4, there was some speculation as to whether white could be better here. Maybe white could play queen d2 and then advance e3, d4 or something, but I definitely think that the weakened king side, so white not having a pawn on the h-file, that limits any sort of advantage that white could have here. And if black ever plays h5 and a later h4, it's not out of the question that white could be regretting their decision to go for this line. So bishop d6 is tactically justified because black has this bishop takes g3 discovery in mind. Also note that on bishop takes g3, you might want to look at a move like bishop takes g7 if you were to get into this position. Desperado. We were looking at some tactics like that earlier in the game, but I don't think it'll work. I didn't really analyze this line thoroughly, but black can play either one of these moves. Probably bishop takes h2 makes more sense. King takes h2, king takes g7. Both kings are looking a little exposed, but perhaps white's king even more so because there's no pawns on the g or h file. Doesn't look so great for white. So Magnus therefore plays rook b1, which could be a helpful move with this pawn advancing and just overprotecting b4 in general. But now we get simplifications. Fabiano takes on f3 with check. Magnus takes with the bishop. And now a6. So taking some control over the b5 square. Magnus plays a4. And now Fabiano plays c6. And this was the critical moment in this game. We're on move 15 here. Magnus spent a lot of time on this next move. So 18 minutes, I believe, was how long he thought here. And I saw a tweet by none other than Garry Kasparov, the legendary Garry Kasparov, former world champion. And he said in this position, perhaps I'm old-fashioned, but if you say A, meaning A4, then you must say B, meaning B5. So he clearly thought that white should play B5 here, as did a lot of the other commentators, because if you're going with these pawns and pushing B4 and A4, it begs the question, why not continue with B5? It's a minority attack. The idea is to try to advance and weaken your opponent's structure. Try to create a weakness to play against, because the structure as is for black is very solid. All these pawns around here guarding key squares. Sorry, again, my board is freaking out a little bit. And even though white has a majority of pawns in the center, playing e3 and d4 takes a little while. And also, even if those moves are played, I'm not sure how great it is because black can end up pushing e4. So the plan of pushing in the center is there. We'll see in another line or two, but b5 was the move that is undoubtedly critical in this position, and Magnus did not play it. He thought for 18 moves, undoubtedly considering the consequences of it, and he played rook e1, which I have a hard time understanding, honestly. I don't particularly know why rook e1 was played. Maybe he didn't want bishop h3 to come with tempo. Maybe he wanted to play e4 and later d4 and have the rook backing up the e-pawn. That seems a little unlikely. I don't know. But let's consider what happens if he had pulled the trigger on b5. And a lot of people were analyzing this, but I think the major reason he didn't do it is that after c takes b5, taking away from the center, a takes b5, black can play this move a5 and gain a protected passed pawn. And a sample continuation, let's say white plays rook a1, trying to put the brakes on that pawn. Black might play rook a7. This escapes the diagonal of the bishop and allows black to play b6. Let's say queen a4, bishop d7. This pawn is attacked 3 times, but I do not believe that white can get away with taking it yet because of b6, and the tactics do not favor white. So let's say bishop d7, rook fc1, and now finally this move b6. And long term, if you're Magnus, you're questioning whether it's worth it to go into a structure like this, because black looks way more solid on the queen side and has this long-term asset. Like, that's always going to be in the back of your head. This protected pass a pawn, which could run down the board at some moment. Also, b5 could be weak. And white's majority in the center, it's not really looking like it's working too well. So that was a big moment, though, because the engines do like b5, and it's probably the only way to get something out of this position. I think black is still okay in that line I just looked at, but the engines do slightly prefer white. Whereas you'll see in the game after rook e1, black is completely fine. So Fabiano played bishop d7 here. Nice move, completing development and also reinforcing the b5 square. I should also mention, just for completeness sake, after b5, the reason why black wants to take this way and then play a5 is if we get this series of captures and black just sort of tries to solidly defend the pawn on c6, then a structure like this is exactly what white is hoping for. They're hoping to, after having advanced these pawns, exploit a weakness that white has created and just hammer away at this pawn. So that's kind of the end goal of this b5 idea. I note that here, if a takes b5, a takes b5, c takes b5, then rook takes b5, and black has a similar weakness to contend with here, and white has moves like queen b3, maybe even tripling up to try to eventually win that pawn. But all of this is just theoretical because Magnus did not play b5. He played rook e1, bishop d7, and now e3. So he advances this e-pawn, and Fabiano plays queen f6, getting the queen off the back rank, also eyeing this bishop. Magnus plays bishop e4. Advancing the pawn to e3 does give white some potential to play d4 or f4 later on. So that maybe was the reason for that particular move. But now Fabiano played bishop f5, looking to liquidate the bishops. And now here, I was invited as a guest on the chess.com broadcast today with Grandmaster Robert Hess and International Master Danny Wrench. And I joined them right about this position, I think right after bishop f5 was played. And we got to break down the position for the next few moves. So bishop f5 is what Fabiano did. Magnus responded with queen f3. And I was speculating that on the broadcast that maybe Fabiano would play bishop g6 here and try to keep a little tension. I think that move is okay. But he chose a much more straightforward continuation. He took on e4. And now Magnus took on f6. G takes f6. And then d takes e4. And we get this interesting structure where both sides have a set of doubled pawns. But it's hard for white to make anything out of this position. There is still the possibility of b5 on the table. But with Fabiano's next move, he ends any potential white has for that advance. So he advances b5 himself. And this was a move that we were discussing and actually said at the time, the more I looked at b5, the more I liked it. It does create backward pawns here and here, but it's hard for white to attack those pawns. One thing that stands out to me about b5 is that it's now very difficult for white to ever activate this bishop if he can't ever push b5 and get it working. In fact, the bishop may be relegated to passive defense, holding on to that pawn on b4. So Here, Magnus played rook ed1. This rook, kind of this mysterious rook e1 move, we can see it's not really doing anything anymore, stacked up against those pawns. So he shifts it over here and attacks the bishop. Fabiano just drops it back to f8. Fabiano did think for a while on this move. Time wasn't really a big factor in this game, but he did think for something like 10 or 11 minutes here. Bishop f8, I think, is nice and solid. And now Magnus takes on b5. In the broadcast, we were looking at bishop e1, which was a suggestion of Robert Hess, trying to keep the tension and maybe trying to make way for rook d to c1, attacking this pawn on c6. And we were looking at various lines here. I think the engine likes the move rook ec8, sort of prophylaxis, guarding the c6 pawn before white even attacks it. But there is the important question of whether black can take on a4. So one line we were examining was b takes a4. This does split up black's pawns, but hey, a pawn's a pawn and white needs to get it back. So we're looking at rook a1 and now this possibility of a5. Advancing, letting white take, but then playing a3 and having the bishop guard this pawn from a distance. In fact, both bishops are guarding a pawn. And after rook dc1, maybe rook a6, and I was saying perhaps black could double the rooks and then play bishop e7 to d8, go after this pawn. I ran this through the engine just out of curiosity. It does say that white is better here, but even with that computer advantage, it seems hard to make anything of this position. But Magnus decided to take on b5 immediately after bishop f8, so he did not keep the tension. Advancing a5, by the way, I don't think is that appealing because black can always play c5 and then trade this. And this is similar to one of the scenarios we looked at earlier where Magnus was hesitating over the b5 move, where black has a protected pass pawn and the fact that b4 could be on the cards later, whereas white's extra pawn, if you will, is kind of stuck on the king side. I don't think this is great for white at all. White's probably just worse here. So Magnus takes on b5, and Fabiano takes with the a-pawn, takes towards the center, thereby opening the file for the rook. And this rook a4 move proves to be very handy. Magnus plays king g2. Fabiano first plays rook ed8, offering a trade of rooks. Magnus declines, he plays rook dc1. If rook takes d8 is played, possible continuation. Rook c1, again looking to move the bishop, but I think again black can activate the rook via the a file and try to come to a4. This looks pretty good to me. So rook dc1, Magnus trying to keep some material on board. King g7, black moves the king up the board. Bishop back to e1, attacking the pawn on c6. Fabiano defends, rook d to c8. Rook c2. And now comes rook a4. And this reminds white that white cannot simply double up the rooks and expect to get an advantage because black will always take on b4 if that happens. So if rook b to c1, bishop takes b4, bishop takes b4, rook takes b4, trade on c6, and black is definitely not losing this. In fact, black would pick up the e4 pawn in this line, and only black could play this for a win with the extra pawn. So this is a useful form of defense, counterattack, in fact. Attacking one of your opponent's weaknesses and not simply blindly defending what is perceived to be a weakness. So active defense by Fabiano here. Magnus played king f3. Also possible to try to activate this pawn mass. Remember, white does have an extra pawn here with the 5 versus the 4. So maybe f4 could be played, making way for king f3. I just had a line f4, h5, king f3, bishop d6 perhaps. Black can just wait. But it's really hard to see how white makes progress from here without risking something significant. Because at all times, white's pieces are tied down. At least 2 pieces have to be assigned to defend b4. And I think white's king alone is not enough to really punch through on the king side. So Magnus played king f3. Fabiano played h5. And probably here was the last chance to try something active if you're Magnus. So he played king e2, just dropping back. I know Peter Svidler, I saw him analyzing g4, trying to get a pass pawn, maybe dreaming of even using the f5 square, which is something that was talked about a lot. f5 is a weakness. Maybe white can get their king up there someday. But the problem is black doesn't have to allow that. So on g4, just defend the pawn with the king, king g6. And so long as black doesn't voluntarily play h takes g4 too soon, again, it's really hard to see how white does anything here. Black has a lot of waiting moves they can make. They can shuttle the bishop back and forth between d6, e7, f8. If ever this happens, yeah, the king position looks kind of weird, but white's pieces are relatively passive. Again, the rook on b1 and the bishop on e1 are needed to defend b4 at all times, and white's king is not going to be able to make it up to f5. This pawn, which is passed, is not going anywhere. So Magnus could poke with g4 or maybe start with h4, then g4, but doesn't seem to be working. So he just decides to play his king backwards after h5. But this allows Fabiano this straightforward plan of playing king g6. And now after h3, playing f5. Excellent technique. Getting rid of his doubled pawn. And in fact, he does allow white to trade off one of their double pawns. But he kind of activates his king in the process too. So there's a trade. King takes f5. Magnus plays f3. Now Fabiano just plays a useful move. Waiting, bishop e7. And yeah, really hard to believe that white has anything with these pawns on the 4th rank. And still that weakness persisting here. If you want to think about it purely in terms of structure, because we've talked about that a lot with the 3 previous games in this World Championship, white does have 2 pawn islands, 2 blacks 3, but it's too thin. It's too thin of any sort of advantage. It may not even be an advantage. So if ever g4 is played, black gets to trade off this weakness. So the fact that black has a little bit more space and probably also a little bit more activity with this and this, that easily makes up for the 2 versus 3 pawn island situation. Magnus plays e4 check, king e6, bishop to d2, bishop d6. Yeah, I think these last 2 moves are more or less waiting for both sides. And now move 34, rook b to c1, and at this point Magnus offered a draw, which was accepted. So we had our 4th draw in a row to start this World Championship match. And why offer a draw here? Well, I think Magnus realized he wasn't really getting anywhere. It's kind of risky even for white to start advancing, so if something like g4 is played instead of rook b c1 after takes, again, black gets rid of that weakness over there. If h takes g4, I think just f6 can be played. I don't really see how white's ever doing anything here. Maybe risky is an overstatement. I don't think even here white's really taking a risk of losing. But yeah, there's no progress to be made. I think Magnus realized that. If the game were to continue after rook b c1, there's a couple ways for black to play. King d7 looks fine if black wants to just defend the weakness on c6. But also, black could definitely play bishop takes b4. And if we get a trade here, say all these pieces come off the board, white takes with check, king e7. You might be tempted to go after this pawn on h5, but then there's these checks from the side, and yeah, white's not going to be able to play this for a win. If the king wants to escape the checks, it's going to have to march over, something like this, but yeah, I think black will easily draw this position. Can just defend e5, g3 is also hanging. So, you know, even some simplifying continuation like this is going to lead to a quick handshake. So there is a rule that says you can't offer a draw before move 30. So they didn't make it to time control, which was move 40, but they were past the 30 move mark. So a draw is okay to be agreed here, which is indeed what happened. So as I said, if we add in the scores, I forgot to do this in the last video, but here is the updated scores in this 12-game match. All draws to open it. But don't fret, guys. There will be action in this match. There always is. This happens a lot in World Championship matches. There's often this feeling out process at the beginning. You can see that both players were a little hesitant. In this game, we see Magnus hesitant with the b5 move, where, you know, everyone was screaming in the chess world, why don't you continue with b5 instead of this mysterious and possibly close to useless rook e1 move. But those are tough decisions. Remember in the previous game, Fabiano faced that early tough decision whether to take the pawn on c5, and he didn't do it either. So I do get the sense that both players are not exactly trigger happy right now, and they're content to play solid chess and just let the match marinate and see what happens in the remaining parts of the match. I think this should favor Magnus, the fact that there are draws in this match, because Magnus is a fantastic rapid and blitz player, and that's the tiebreak. It's 4 games of, I believe, 25 plus 10 rapid if it does get to a tiebreaker, if there's a 6-6 tie after 12 games. So I believe that should favor Magnus, but it's not that big of a deal. There's still plenty of games for Fabiano to try to get a decisive result in here. And maybe if it does go to a tiebreaker, Fabiano will shock everyone. It's a little early to forecast that. I think there's a lot of chess to be played, but you know, it does bear thinking about as we get more and more draws on the score table here. But nonetheless, hopefully you got something out of this game. I think this was probably the most dull game of the 4 games so far. But we'll see what happens in round 5 with Fabiano again having the white pieces. And then I believe after that, Magnus gets 2 whites in a row. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll be back again with round 5 analysis, game 5 analysis. I also want to mention tomorrow, which is Wednesday, November 14th, is a rest day. If you want to see me recap these games in greater detail and also interact with the audience, if you want to ask me questions, check out my Twitch channel. I'm doing the rest day coverage. It starts at 12 o'clock p.m. noon U.S. Central Time. That's 1800 GMT. So hope to see you there. Thanks, guys. Bye.